It's that time of year again where I share who I think will be making moves in the driver market for next season. It's going to be an interesting year for F1 with many potential rumours going round. So let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. Coming into 2023, 6 of the 10 teams on the grid have made changes to their driver lineup. This is a pretty significant shift, so I think it's reasonable to assume that many teams will be sticking with the same drivers for 2024, but there are a few changes that may be on the horizon. McLaren's decision to end Ricciardo's contract early was a difficult one to make. The team had a tricky situation where the more experienced race-winning driver in their team was underperforming next to his less experienced teammate in Lando Norris. The team seized the opportunity to steal the hottest young prospect not yet in Formula 1 in Oscar Piastri from their direct rivals, Alpine. This move was great for McLaren, a team that has a decent track record of bringing in young talent into the sport and allowing them to thrive. Norris has signed up to a long-term deal with the McLaren team and he's done so well in his time with them up to this point. I expect he'll have another strong year for them in 2023 and get the absolute maximum from his McLaren this year. As for Piastri, well, I think his track record speaks for itself. He's succeeded in every single junior Formula category that he's competed in, and I have no doubt that he'll be able to adapt to this potentially challenging McLaren car. This pairing is very young and has a huge amount of potential, so it's now up to McLaren to deliver this pair a great car. So for me, it will be no change from McLaren in 2024. Aston Martin. I think Aston Martin's lineup is also likely to remain static. It's quite clear that Lance Stroll has a long-term future with this setup, given it's his father that owns the team. Similarly, Fernando Alonso was just moved to the setup to replace the retired Sebastian Vettel. Alonso has signed a multi-year deal with the team, and that was one of the key elements that motivated him to join this team rather than sticking with Alpine. I think that the move to get Alonso shows the ambition of the Aston Martin team. Since they've taken on that name, they've always had a world champion driver in the setup, and if you look at teams that have taken some time to build to compete for the championship in the future, they've often had an experienced champion in the team when they're building towards success, just as Mercedes did with Michael Schumacher back in 2010. I think that the Aston Martin lineup is good, but I feel like they're going to be held back by Lance Stroll once again if they get towards the sharp end of the grid. Of course, with another experienced teammate, he may develop through the year, but it's clear that very few other teams would be too interested in keeping Stroll in their seat. So for me, it's going to be the same lineup at Aston Martin for 2024. Alpine. Another changed driver lineup for this year is at Alpine. Both Ocon and Gasly now have long-term contracts with Alpine and are set to be in a good place for the future with this lineup. I would comment that I don't think they have a clear team leader in there at the moment. I think they have an above-average driver lineup on the grid with 2 drivers about to hit their peak. To add to this, I think the fact that the 2 drivers are both French will be great for the team from a commercial perspective, but there remains a question over the pair's relationship off track, with them both having a history of not really liking each other, and potentially they could clash if they're racing closely this year. Ocon's relationship with Alonso was pretty hostile by the end of last season after several on-track incidents where he pushed the boundaries, so it'll be interesting to see if the same happens again this year. But I highly doubt anything will happen that means the team would need to change their driver lineup for 2024. Ferrari. Another team with 2 drivers that are contracted for 2024 is Ferrari. They have a brilliant pairing in Leclerc and Sainz that will work well together. There's a lot that Fred Vasseur will want to change coming into his first season in charge of the Italian champions, but the driver lineup will almost certainly not be one of them. Charles Leclerc made a couple of mistakes in 2022, but it was the car's disappointing development and the poor strategy from the team that meant he was unable to compete for the championship right up to the end of the season. Leclerc has taken on the team leader role based on last year, and he's one of the most talented drivers to have come through the Ferrari Academy. He's committed to the team for the long term, and to be honest, I don't see him going anywhere else unless there's an opportunity comes up at a team that's consistently beating Ferrari. I don't think that's too likely for 2024, and so there's no doubt about his future. Sainz is slightly less assured of his Ferrari seat. He's under contract for 2024, so he can be confident he'll be staying, but his position at the team may be under more of a threat towards the end of this year if his costly mistakes continue. Either way, I don't see the team making big changes for 2024. Mercedes. Mercedes are a team that had a new driver pairing for 2022. They made a big decision to put 2 top-tier drivers together as they promoted George Russell to the team, replacing the team's number 2 driver, Valtteri Bottas. For me, I think the only question in this team is whether Hamilton wants to stay or retire. And after last season, I think it could have been understandable for the British driver to want to leave the sport, given how Mercedes was significantly less competitive than they'd been for the last 8 years. But by the end of the season, with the momentum firmly in Mercedes' favour, I think it was clear that the motivation of the team and the drivers has not dropped. Hamilton wants to win his 8th World Championship, and I think he's not going to be disheartened by one difficult season. This season is important for Mercedes to take another step towards Red Bull. The gap between them is probably too large to bridge in a single year, but if they make a meaningful step towards that, then there's even more of a reason for Hamilton to stay for 2024, which is why I expect him to stay put and the Mercedes lineup to stay the same. Williams have replaced Nicholas Latifi with Logan Sargent for 2023. This was a significant move as it took them away from a pay driver in the lineup and towards one with a driver from their own academy. However, for me, I think Sargent would have benefited from another year in Formula 2 to ensure he was more ready for the F1 grid. I anticipate the American driver having a difficult year, with lots to learn in a short period of time. However, given how long Latifi was able to stay in that Williams team, I don't anticipate Sargent being dropped after a single season. The team are in another rebuild phase and they need some stability in their drivers if they want to build back away from the back of the order. As for Alex Albon, well, he signed a multi-year deal with the team last year, so he's got a good opportunity to solidify his position in a well-established team. I'm sure if he keeps up his performances from last year, some other teams will be considering him for a drive in the future. But I don't anticipate that happening in the next year, as I think he'll be keen to stay put in the Williams setup and take advantage of the fact that he's got a long-term future with the Williams team. Red Bull have a massive decision to make for 2024. They've expressed some disappointment with the performances of Sergio Perez in the last year, as he almost went missing for a good part of the second half of the season. The team was so dominant that the fact that they didn't get a 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship may be something that frustrates the leadership. Not only this, but they've the perfect replacement on the books in Daniel Ricciardo, a driver who left the team at the end of 2018 to try and take an opportunity elsewhere on the grid. Ricciardo returns to Red Bull with his reputation through the floor after 2 very difficult seasons with McLaren, but that doesn't take away from the fact that he's been the teammate to give Max Verstappen his closest challenge in that Red Bull. For me, Sergio Perez has done enough to warrant keeping hold of his seat for 2024. I think it would be foolish to change a driver when the team have won the last 2 Drivers' Championships with his support, and move to a driver that may not have the confidence to perform as he did in the past. To add, Ricciardo left the team being frustrated by how much the team were focusing on Verstappen. Realistically, the team won't be changing that mindset and will likely have doubled down on it by now, considering he's a double world champion. So I think it would be silly to replace Perez with Ricciardo, as many others are predicting. As for Verstappen, there's no need to really discuss him leaving. He's in the right team and has a long-term contract with them. There's no chance of him going elsewhere, in my view. Haas have made a change this year, with Magnussen being joined by Hülkenberg for 2023. For me, this is a driver pairing that isn't all that interesting. They're 2 solid drivers with midfield experience in the sport. Bringing Magnussen in last year was a really strong boost for the team as they'd upgraded a driver, but it felt odd that they had replaced Mick Schumacher with Hülkenberg for this year. But I also don't see Haas wanting to change their driver pairing. They are what Haas are looking for, and looking outside of their team, I don't see any other drivers being up for grabs that I can anticipate wanting to move in and upgrade the pairing. The only driver that might be considered could be Daniel Ricciardo, but I anticipate him moving elsewhere for 2024. AlphaTauri. As for AlphaTauri, this team is one that may be changing for next year. I anticipate the change in teammate for Yuki Tsunoda will likely result in the Japanese driver underperforming, and he'll struggle to keep hold of his seat. Tsunoda has underperformed in the sport for the 2 years that he's been in it, and I think that if there had been a strong driver ready for the sport earlier, then I think Tsunoda would have left the sport by now. Nick De Vries was a good recruit by AlphaTauri. They've taken a driver from the Mercedes setup, and he's won with a point to prove after a brilliant Formula E career and a brilliant one-off performance in the Williams car last year at Monza. I expect De Vries will perform very well in the AlphaTauri, which will mean he'll secure another season with that team, but I think Yuki Tsunoda will end up being replaced. The obvious replacement is Liam Lawson. The Red Bull Junior driver has performed well in the Junior Series and came 3rd in F2 last year. This season, he's driving in the Super Formula whilst being supported by Red Bull, and his achievements in F2 last year means he's got the required Super License points. Not only this, but Liam Lawson made 3 appearances in FP1 last year for both Alpha Towery and Red Bull, and I think there were signs toward the end of the season that they were happy with how he was performing. As a result, I think that replacing Tsunoda with Lawson is an easy option for them to execute for 2024, so I think it will be that sensible move for the team. Alfa Romeo. The final team to discuss is Alfa Romeo, or by this point they'll be Sauber once again. This team is in a really interesting transition phase, with the Audi takeover not officially happening until 2026. For me, this is a really exciting prospect, as they'll probably move up the order with the new investment in the team, and I think there's a real possibility that they'll be a strong contender in the future with the Audi backing. And so with that investment, they can start to move towards a stronger driver lineup as well. Currently the team have Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu, and it's a good mix of a strong and experienced driver and a younger pay driver to keep the team going. I don't anticipate that they'll need the Zhou money in the future. They have the backing needed to ensure they won't go under in the time between now and 2026, and they will want the drivers that are ready for the challenge and the future prospect of being an Audi team. Zhou had a tricky debut season in 2022. He had a difficult start to the year, and then after the team dropped down the order, he couldn't capitalise on the fact that he'd improved his level relative to Bottas. I think that he won't be able to match the Finnish driver over the course of the season again in 2023, and so I think with the new CEO in Andreas Seidel, they'll want to give Ricciardo another opportunity to get back on the grid and give him a chance to race in a team that has the potential to get back up the order. Last year, Ricciardo may have had an opportunity to move to Alfa Romeo and have rejected it, but I think that in reality he had a desire to take a year away from the sport to regroup mentally. Going into next year, I expect he'll be keen to take any opportunity to rejoin the grid, so for me, it'll be Valtteri Bottas and Daniel Ricciardo in the Alfa Romeo or Sauber next year. So with just 2 changes for 2024, I have just Yuki Tsunoda and Zhou Guanyu leaving the F1 grid next year. I appreciate that this is a very cautious prediction, but given the large-scale changes of last year and the relatively stable regulations, I don't anticipate there being many moves in the driver market throughout this season. I hope I'm wrong, as silly season is always interesting, but I can't see there being many rumours other than the Ricciardo versus Perez story. As always, let me know in the comments which moves you anticipate for 2024, and make sure to subscribe for more F1 content going into the 2023 season.